So you want to convert your bike to a one by or single chainring setup? Well, fantastic, because that is exactly what I'm going to do in this video. I'm also going to explain the pros and cons of using such a setup. So I am switching the setup of my bike because I'm about to head and do a race, and I kind of felt like, do you know what, I want to give a one by setup a go and thought it would be a good process to show you guys at home in case you want to do the same as well. So what are the things that you're going to need to do this job? Well, of course, you're going to need a one by specific chainring that matches up with the fitment of your crank. You're also going to need a selection of other items such as some chainring bolts, which are slightly shorter and narrower to match up with your chainring. You're going to need a new chain because you're going to have to make your chain slightly longer. Probably going to also need a slightly wider range cassette unless you already have a particularly wide range cassette on your bike. Some kind of chain keeper device is also a good idea as we're going to be removing the front derailleur. And then at the same time as fitting all of this, I'm also going to install an oversized pulley wheel, but just to be clear, that's absolutely not crucial to this job whatsoever. But why not? I've got the chance to do it. In terms of the tools that you're going to need for the job, you're going to need a selection of Torx keys. Also going to need a selection of hex keys and a chain tool, and of course, finally, the tools to be able to remove your cassette from your bike. So first thing we need to do is actually set about taking all of the parts off of my bike. So that's the chain rings, the chain, the cassette, and then that pulley wheel cage as well. So let's get to it. Okay, so that's everything off of the bike, and I've actually compiled it all together on top of the scales because if we go through the pros and cons of running a one by setup, well, typically the advantages that people say are it's lighter weight and it's more aero. Typically the advantages that we can talk about for running a one by setup are that it's ever so slightly less efficient if you're running extreme angles and cross chaining. The narrow wide tooth profile of one by chainring typically is also a little bit less efficient, and then generally you're going to be sacrificing some sort of extreme gearing range. So it's suitable for some situations but not for a wide range. But when it comes to actually the weight that the parts are actually lighter, because you think, well, we're removing the front derailleur and we're going 2 chainrings to 1, that's not actually the case here. So the weight of all of the parts which I've taken off is 744 grams. Now the weight of the parts which I'm about to put on is actually 100 grams more than that. So don't always assume one by setups are lighter than the others, because I think in this instance, we're going for larger chainrings which are heavier, and then because we're going for the larger cassette, that's also slightly heavier. And it's important also to note that here in the cassette size is where some of the mid-tier group sets perhaps have an advantage over the top-tier ones, because if you've got 12-speed Shimano Dura-Ace, which we've got here, the biggest cassette size you can use is an 11 to 34, whereas if you go down to the mid-tier group set, Shimano 105, it goes all the way up to an 1136. So in that instance, well, maybe a 105 might be a slightly better option. Anyway, what we're going to do next is get all of these fancy shiny parts fitted onto the bike, and it's basically the reversal process of how I took everything off. And I'm going to start by fitting this oversized pulley wheel system, which, as I mentioned earlier, is actually not crucial, but a luxury that I'm going to fit onto the bike. Let's do it. Now that I've got the chain rings off, before I put them back on, there's an important job to address here. We're not putting the front derailleur back on. So what the hell am I going to do with this cable? Well, there's a little rubber grommet on almost all bikes, if they're running an electronic group set, that you can unpick and then feed the cable back inside the frame and put the little rubber grommet back in place to stop all the dirt and grime flying straight inside your frame. Failing that, you could just put a small little piece of tape over the hole and keep it all neat and tidy. Any little additional clips, such as this, which is on the end of the DI2 cable, you need to keep safe with all of the parts which you've just removed from your bike. Because after all, if all of the parts which you've taken off aren't actually worn out, keep them all, because if you decide a one by setup isn't for you, well, you can put it all back on and just forget that you even wasted your time doing the whole process. Just get this cable tidy. did actually do that one too tight. I just broke it. Okay, so that horrible click and terrified look on my face was effectively the bolt of the chainring snapping because I did it up too tight, which highlights the whole reason why bolts have torque ratings written on them, to avoid running into that problem. But problem averted, because I've got myself a new chainring bolt, and it was actually a relatively simple fix. But that highlights why torque wrenches are an important tool to have in your toolbox. Right, let's get this thing back on track and sort out this chainring bolt. So because this is an aftermarket chainring, not a Shimano specific one, it doesn't actually sit super nice and flush and integrate with the crank arm. So what we've got here are some small little 3D printed covers, which mean the transition from the chainring to the crank arm is nice and smooth, and it makes it look a far nicer thing. So let's just clip these in place. It also covers up my little chainring bolt accident, but whatever. Okay, we're onto the chain next. As I mentioned, lots of different ways to go about sizing the chain, most of them which we've covered in previous videos on how to size your chain correctly. But as long as you understand the key principle, it makes your life a lot easier, and you can go about lots of different ways of doing it. So what you're trying to achieve is to make sure that the chain isn't so long that when you're in the physically smallest gears on your bike, the chain is long and droopy and has got no tension to it, but also make sure the chain isn't so short that when you use the physically largest gears on your bike, the rear derailleur cage isn't stretched as far as physically possible and could lead to causing some damage. Also, because we have fitted a larger size cassette, we're going to have to make a small adjustment to the B-limit screw to make sure that this top pulley wheel doesn't contact the largest sprocket on the cassette when we shift up into that gear. So we'll be doing that at the same time. Right, let's feed the chain through and get an assessment on how much we need to take off. So what I want to do here is overlap the sections of chain and pull it tight so it's just applying a little bit of tension onto the derailleur cage when I'm in the smallest sprocket at the back. Once I can see where the chain crosses over, I can then account for where my quick link is going to be and then break the chain here. And the best rule of thumb is if you're a bit unsure and you're halfway between two different links, always make the chain slightly longer, because you can always make it shorter at a later stage if you find that that's a better setup for you. Fresh quick links with all new chains. Now most manufacturers will say these are single use only. In my experience, you can use them a few times over, but once they stop having a positive click and engagement to them, it's time to replace them. But err on the side of caution, as always. And they've also got small little arrows to denote the rotational direction of the chain, so make sure you fit your quick link the correct way round. Now the chain is in place, we can start to shift into the large sprockets, but we need to do so carefully because we also need to adjust this B-limit screw at the same time to make sure we can effectively pivot the derailleur down like this to keep this top pulley wheel out of harm's way. Adjustment of the B-limit screw on the back of the derailleur is to position it so we can make sure the teeth on the cassette here are never going to contact the teeth on the pulley wheel, which is just underneath this section of chain here. We need to have a small little gap to enable it to all work correctly and not run into any problems. You want to get it close, but ensure there's a gap. So running a 1x specific chainring with the narrow wide tooth profile does mean that you do have the option of not needing the front derailleur, or the option that you can do away completely with some sort of chain guide. Now I am going to put one on just because it feels like a nice little safety net to have, particularly when you're using a rear derailleur that doesn't have a clutch in there to help keep the chain nice and securely on the bike. So this is what's going in place of our front derailleur, and we can position it at the highest point where the chainring is to make sure it's just not going to rub wherever we are on the gear range at the back. So that is everything everything bolted onto the bike, set up and ready to go. I personally think it looks like a pretty slick setup, but whether you disagree or not, well, you can let me know in the comments section down below. But the proof as to how this setup performs is going to come at the weekend when I go and race this bike. Now, I do think that in certain race situations, one by setup has its purpose, or perhaps if you live in an area where it's particularly flat and you find yourself not using a small chainring, it kind of does make sense. But it is important to note that I have gone for an overall larger chainring at the front because I'm going to be using this bike for racing. It makes sense with the higher speeds that are associated to that. But there are lots of online charts and calculators where you can put in information such as the cassette size, the chainring size, and then it will give you the information of different speeds and cadences that you're riding at to make sure you choose gear ratios that are optimal for your riding conditions. Right, anyway, it's a fun experiment. I'm looking forward to riding this bike, testing it out, and I think I feel quite happy that I've done this job. Anyway, if you want to see more maintenance videos similar to this, subscribe to GCNTech and turn on your notifications. And as I've said, let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. Right, I'm out of here. See you later.